Money can't buy class, but it sure can make you believe you're untouchable. Tonight, Marcus Wellington thought he owned the world, until he discovered the world had already changed hands. What happens when the tables turn so dramatically that a single moment of cruelty becomes a masterclass in karma? Some lessons cost more than money can ever repay, and some people you should never underestimate. Welcome to an evening where pride meets its match, and where the person you least expect holds all the power. Marcus Wellington adjusted his platinum cufflinks for the third time that evening, checking his reflection in the polished marble of the hotel lobby. The Grandview Ballroom buzzed with the kind of energy that only came from gatherings of the truly wealthy. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across designer gowns and tailored suits, while servers in crisp white uniforms moved silently between guests carrying champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. At 45, Marcus had built his fortune from nothing, or at least that's how he told the story now. The truth was messier, involving a combination of inheritance, lucky investments, and stepping on anyone who got in his way. But tonight wasn't about truth. It was about image, connections, and reminding everyone present exactly where he stood in the social hierarchy. Marcus, darling. The voice belonged to Victoria Ashford, whose family owned half the city's real estate. She glided toward him with the practiced grace of someone born into money. I was hoping you'd be here tonight. Have you met the Hendersons? They're looking for investors in their new tech venture. Marcus smiled the calculated smile he'd perfected over years of business dealings. Always happy to meet fellow entrepreneurs, Victoria. Though I have to say, tech ventures are risky these days. So many people think they can strike it rich with the next big app. The conversation flowed as these conversations always did. Surface pleasantries hiding deeper calculations. Who was worth knowing? Who had something to offer? Who could be useful later? Marcus navigated these waters with the skill of someone who had learned that relationships were just another form of currency. The ballroom itself was magnificent, he had to admit. Whoever had organized this charity auction clearly understood the importance of setting. The auction was supposedly for some children's foundation, though Marcus couldn't be bothered to remember the details. These events were all the same, an excuse for wealthy people to write tax-deductible checks while feeling good about themselves. As he moved through the crowd, Marcus caught glimpses of conversations around him. Business deals being discussed over canapes. Political connections being leveraged between sips of wine. Marriage alliances being subtly negotiated through seemingly casual introductions. This was his world, and he ruled it with the confidence of someone who had never known real failure. The art collection tonight is quite impressive, commented James Fitzgerald, a banking executive Marcus had been cultivating for months. Whoever curated this has excellent taste. And expensive taste, clearly. Marcus nodded, though he hadn't paid much attention to the artwork lining the walls. Art was just another investment to him, something to buy when you had too much money and needed to park it somewhere that would appreciate. Indeed, though I find that true connoisseurs focus more on the value than the aesthetics these days. The irony of his statement was lost on him. Marcus had become so focused on the price of everything that he'd forgotten the value of anything. His ex-wife had tried to tell him that once, during one of their final arguments before the divorce. Sarah had accused him of treating people like balance sheets, always calculating what they could do for him rather than seeing them as human beings. But Sarah was gone now, taking their son David with her. The divorce had been bitter, fought over every asset and custody arrangement. Marcus had won most of the financial battles, keeping the majority of their wealth through careful legal maneuvering. Sarah had walked away with less than she deserved, in Marcus's opinion, not because she deserved more money, but because she had disrupted his perfectly ordered life. The thought of Sarah still irritated him. She had been beautiful once, elegant in the way that had attracted him when they were both younger and hungrier. But she had never fully understood the sacrifices required to build real wealth. She'd wanted him to spend more time at home, to prioritize family over business deals. She'd never grasped that the business deals were what made the family possible in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, a voice announced over the sound system. We'll be beginning the auction in 30 minutes. Please take this time to review the catalog and place your preliminary bids. Marcus picked up a glossy catalog from a nearby table, flipping through pages of donated items. vacation homes in the Hamptons, private jet trips to European capitals, original artwork from masters whose names were more valuable than their actual talent. The usual array of luxury experiences that allowed the wealthy to outbid each other for bragging rights. "Quite the selection this year," said a voice beside him. Marcus turned to see Robert Chun, a fellow real estate mogul who specialized in commercial properties. "Though I have to wonder who organized all this. The quality is remarkably high." "Someone with connections, clearly," Marcus replied. "And someone who knows how to squeeze money out of people like us." They shared a laugh, the kind of cynical chuckle that came from men who understood exactly how these events worked. The charity angle was nice, but the real purpose was networking, status display, and the peculiar satisfaction that came from spending large amounts of money in public. As Marcus continued browsing the catalog, he noticed several items that caught his attention. A week-long stay at a private resort in the Caribbean. A rare bottle of wine from a vintage that predated his birth. A private dinner prepared by a celebrity chef. These weren't just purchases, they were statements, ways of demonstrating that he belonged in this rarefied atmosphere. The crowd around him represented the pinnacle of success by any reasonable measure. CEOs of major corporations, inherited wealth spanning generations, self-made entrepreneurs who had built empires from nothing. And yet, Marcus felt a strange sense of restlessness that he couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the way certain conversations died when he approached certain groups, or the polite smiles that didn't quite reach people's eyes when they thought he wasn't looking. Marcus had always assumed that his wealth automatically granted him acceptance in these circles, but lately he'd begun to suspect that acceptance and tolerance were two different things. The auction proceeded smoothly through its first several items. Marcus bid successfully on a weekend at a ski resort, more out of habit than genuine interest. He had no particular love for skiing, but owning such experiences was part of maintaining his image. The $15,000 he spent was pocket change, a rounding error in his monthly budget. As he waited for more interesting items to appear, Marcus allowed his attention to wander around the ballroom. The crowd was the usual mix of old money and new, with a few celebrities thrown in for glamour. He recognized most faces, either from business dealings or society pages. This was a small world, after all, and everyone who mattered eventually crossed paths with everyone else. It was during this casual survey of the room that Marcus first noticed the woman sitting at table 3. She was elegant in a way that caught his attention immediately. Dark hair styled in a sophisticated updo, wearing a midnight blue dress that was clearly expensive but not flashy. Something about her profile seemed familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. She was engaged in animated conversation with a distinguished older gentleman that Marcus recognized as Charles Morrison, one of the city's most influential philanthropists. "Now we come to Lot 15, the auctioneer announced, a magnificent 7-day cruise through the Mediterranean, donated by Oceanic Luxury Lines. Marcus half listened to the bidding, his attention still drawn to the woman at table 3. There was something about the way she carried herself, the confident tilt of her head, the graceful gestures as she spoke. It reminded him of someone, though the memory remained frustratingly elusive. The bidding for the cruise escalated quickly, reaching $30,000 before most participants dropped out. Marcus considered joining, but something held him back. He found himself more interested in studying the mysterious woman than in acquiring another luxury vacation he didn't need. "Sold to table 7 for $35,000, the auctioneer declared, and polite applause rippled through the room. It was then that the woman at table 3 turned slightly, giving Marcus a better view of her face. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. Sarah, his ex-wife, Sarah Mitchell, she'd gone back to her maiden name after the divorce, was sitting not 50 feet away from him, looking more poised and confident than he'd ever seen her during their marriage. The realization left him momentarily speechless, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Sarah had been beautiful during their marriage, but there was something different about her now. She carried herself with a self-assurance that he didn't remember from their years together. During their marriage, she'd often seemed overshadowed by his presence, content to support his ambitions while keeping her own dreams carefully tucked away. But the woman he was looking at now was no shadow of anyone. She commanded attention without demanding it, drew respect without insisting on it. The transformation was so complete that Marcus found himself wondering if he'd ever really known the woman he'd been married to for 12 years. "Dad?" a young voice said beside him. Marcus turned to see a teenager approaching table 3, and his second shock of the evening struck him even harder than the first. David, his son, now 15 and tall for his age, was walking towards Sarah's table with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in this environment. Marcus hadn't seen his son in person for nearly 6 months, their relationship having deteriorated to occasional phone calls and holiday visits that felt more like obligation than connection. But what shocked Marcus more than David's presence was how the boy looked. Gone was the awkward, uncertain teenager from their last meeting. David now carried himself with the same quiet confidence that Marcus had noticed in Sarah. His suit was perfectly tailored, his posture straight, his movements purposeful. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," David said as he reached Sarah's table. The presentation ran longer than expected. Presentation? Marcus felt his confusion deepen. What presentation? And why was his son, his 15-year-old son, attending presentations at a charity auction filled with the city's elite? "How did it go?" Sarah asked, and Marcus could hear the warmth and pride in her voice even from across the room. "Better than expected," David replied. "Mr. Morrison thinks we'll exceed our fundraising goals by at least 20%. Charles Morrison, the philanthropist Marcus had noticed earlier, leaned forward with obvious interest. "David's been instrumental in organizing the youth outreach component of tonight's event," he said to Sarah. "His ideas for engaging younger donors have been remarkably sophisticated." Marcus felt as though he was watching a scene from an alternate reality. This confident young man discussing fundraising strategies and outreach programs couldn't be the same son who had seemed so lost and directionless during their last conversation. And Sarah, laughing and discussing charitable work with one of the city's most respected philanthropists, was nothing like the quiet, domestically focused woman he remembered from their marriage. "The next item up for bidding," the auctioneer continued, "is truly special. A collection of original artwork donated by the Morrison Foundation, featuring pieces by several contemporary masters." But Marcus was no longer paying attention to the auction. His focus was entirely on the impossible scene playing out at table 3. Sarah was not just attending this event as a guest. She was clearly involved in its organization. The respect and familiarity with which Charles Morrison spoke to her suggested a professional relationship, not a casual social connection. How was this possible? During their marriage, Sarah had shown little interest in charitable work beyond writing occasional checks. She had preferred to focus on their home, their family, their private world. Marcus had always assumed this was her natural inclination, that she was simply more suited to domestic life than public engagement. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that perhaps Sarah had simply never been given the opportunity to shine in their marriage. Perhaps his domineering approach to their relationship had overshadowed her own ambitions and capabilities. The thought was deeply uncomfortable, challenging fundamental assumptions about their failed relationship that Marcus had never questioned. "Mom, did you see the final numbers for the Youth Scholarship Fund?" David asked, pulling out what appeared to be a tablet computer. His easy familiarity with discussing financial matters struck Marcus as particularly odd. During their marriage, Sarah had always deferred to Marcus on all financial decisions, claiming she wasn't comfortable with numbers and investments. "The preliminary figures look excellent," Sarah replied, glancing at David's tablet. "We should be able to fund 12 full scholarships this year instead of the 8 we originally planned." 12 scholarships. Marcus did a quick mental calculation and realized that represented several $100,000. Sarah was apparently involved in managing charitable giving on a scale that rivaled some of his own business ventures. Where had she acquired this expertise? And, more importantly, where had she acquired the resources to fund such ambitious programs? "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, "before we continue with our regularly scheduled auction, we have a special presentation from the evening's host." Marcus looked up sharply. The evening's host. He had assumed the event was organized by some committee of society wives, the usual group of wealthy women who planned these affairs as a way of staying busy and socially relevant. He certainly hadn't expected the host to be anyone he knew personally. "Please welcome Sarah Mitchell, founder and executive director of the Children's Future Foundation." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, but Marcus barely heard it. The words hit him like a series of physical blows. Founder, Executive Director, Children's Future Foundation. Sarah, his ex-wife Sarah, was not just attending this event or helping to organize it. She was the host. She had created and now ran the foundation that was being celebrated tonight. Sarah rose gracefully from her seat and walked toward the podium with the kind of confidence that comes from practice and success. She moved like someone accustomed to public speaking, to commanding attention, to being taken seriously by important people. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," she began, her voice clear and strong. "When I founded the Children's Future Foundation 3 years ago, I had a simple goal: to ensure that every child, regardless of their family's financial circumstances, has access to quality education and meaningful opportunities." 3 years ago, Marcus calculated backward and realized that Sarah had started this foundation within months of their divorce being finalized. While he had been assuming she was struggling to rebuild her life after their separation, she had actually been building something entirely new and apparently quite successful. "Thanks to your generosity and support," Sarah continued, "we've been able to provide educational scholarships to over 200 children from low-income families. We've funded after-school programs in 12 underserved communities. And we've created mentorship opportunities that have connected young people with successful professionals who can guide them toward brighter futures." The applause was warm and sustained. Marcus found himself clapping automatically, though his mind was reeling from this revelation. Sarah had not just survived their divorce, she had thrived. She had built something meaningful and important, had gained the respect of people like Charles Morrison, had raised her son to be confident and engaged with the world. Everything Marcus had told himself about their divorce was being challenged by the evidence before his eyes. He had convinced himself that Sarah was better suited to domestic life, that she lacked the drive and ambition necessary for professional success. He had rationalized his own behavior during their marriage by believing that he was the natural leader in their relationship, that Sarah was content to follow his direction. But the woman speaking confidently from the podium was clearly capable of leadership on a significant scale. The foundation she had built was making a real difference in people's lives. The respect she commanded from the assembled guests was genuine and well-earned. "This evening's auction," Sarah continued, "represents more than just an opportunity for generous giving. It represents our collective commitment to ensuring that opportunity is not determined by the circumstances of one's birth, but by one's willingness to work hard and dream big." As she spoke, Marcus found himself remembering conversations from their marriage that he had dismissed at the time. Sarah had occasionally mentioned children in their neighborhood who were struggling academically, who seemed to lack support at home. She had talked about wanting to volunteer at local schools, about using their wealth to make a difference in their community. Marcus had always deflected these conversations, suggesting that they had enough responsibilities without taking on additional charitable obligations. He had preferred to focus on building their own wealth and security rather than worrying about other people's problems. Now he was seeing the full flowering of interests and passions that he had systematically discouraged during their marriage. Marcus sat in stunned silence as David finished his remarks and returned to his mother's table amid another round of enthusiastic applause. The reality of what he was witnessing continued to sink in with each passing moment. This wasn't just an awkward encounter with his ex-family at a social event. This was a complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about the people he had once shared his life with. During the divorce proceedings, Marcus had felt a certain smug satisfaction in knowing that Sarah would struggle without his financial support and social connections. He had given her a settlement that was legally adequate but far from generous, believing that this would teach her to appreciate what she had lost. In his mind, she would eventually come to regret leaving him, would realize that life without his resources and status would be diminished and difficult. Instead, Sarah had apparently taken her modest settlement and built something far more impressive than anything Marcus had achieved. His wealth was substantial but ultimately personal. It benefited only him and his immediate circle. Sarah's foundation was making a tangible difference in hundreds of lives, had earned the respect of the city's most influential philanthropists, and was growing in scope and impact every year. The auction resumed with Sarah back at her table, but Marcus found it impossible to focus on the bidding. His attention remained fixed on table 3, where he could observe the easy interaction between his ex-wife and their son. They moved together like a team, clearly comfortable collaborating on projects and decisions. David showed his mother something on his tablet. She nodded and made a note. They exchanged a quick smile at some private joke. It was the kind of natural partnership that Marcus realized he had never achieved with either of them during their marriage. He had always positioned himself as the decision-maker, the authority figure, the one whose judgment carried the most weight. Sarah and David had been supporting players in the drama of his life, rather than equal participants in a shared family narrative. "Remarkable young man," said Elizabeth Hartwell, an elderly woman sitting at Marcus's table. She had noticed his attention focused on David and Sarah. "Sarah Mitchell has done an extraordinary job raising him, and what she's accomplished with the foundation is truly inspiring." Marcus forced a smile. "Yes, quite impressive. You know, she was married to Marcus Wellington for years," Elizabeth continued, apparently unaware that she was speaking to Marcus himself. "Terrible divorce, from what I understand. He treated her quite poorly, tried to minimize her settlement out of spite. But look how well she's done despite his attempts to hold her back." The words hit Marcus like ice water. Elizabeth Hartwell was one of the city's most socially connected women, someone whose opinions carried weight in the circles Marcus cared about. If she viewed his behavior during the divorce as spiteful and mean-spirited, then others probably shared that assessment. "I don't know the details of their personal situation," Marcus said carefully. "Oh, it was quite the scandal at the time," Elizabeth replied with the relish of someone who enjoyed sharing gossip. "He was convinced she couldn't succeed without him, apparently told people she'd be back begging for support within a year. Shows how little he understood his own wife. Sarah Mitchell has more integrity and capability in her little finger than Marcus Wellington has in his entire body." Marcus felt heat rising in his face. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that Elizabeth didn't understand the full complexity of their marriage and divorce. But anything he said would reveal his identity and make an already uncomfortable situation infinitely worse. "The bidding for Lot 23 is now open," the auctioneer announced. "This stunning necklace donated by Carruthers Fine Jewelry has been appraised at $40,000. Marcus bid on the necklace purely as a distraction, raising his paddle with more aggression than the situation warranted. He quickly found himself in a bidding war with someone at table 6, driving the price up to nearly $60,000 before his opponent finally withdrew. "Sold to table 12 for $58,000, the auctioneer declared. Marcus barely heard the announcement. He had just spent nearly $60,000 on a piece of jewelry he had no use for, purely because he needed some way to channel his growing frustration and confusion. The necklace would sit in a safe deposit box alongside other impulse purchases, beautiful but meaningless objects that represented wealth without purpose. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself studying other guests' reactions to Sarah and David. The respect they commanded was genuine and widespread. People approached their table throughout the evening, clearly wanting to speak with Sarah about the foundation's work or to congratulate David on his presentation. These weren't polite social obligations. They were authentic expressions of admiration and support. Meanwhile, Marcus realized that his own interactions with other guests had been more superficial. People were polite to him, certainly, and his wealth ensured that his presence was acknowledged and respected. But there was a qualitative difference between the warm regard directed towards Sarah and the careful courtesy extended to him. During their marriage, Marcus had often criticized Sarah for being too soft, too focused on feelings rather than results. He had prided himself on being practical, logical, focused on measurable outcomes rather than abstract ideals. But looking at what Sarah had accomplished, Marcus was forced to acknowledge that perhaps those qualities he had dismissed as weaknesses were actually strengths he had never learned to recognize or value. The foundation Sarah had built was successful precisely because it was grounded in genuine concern for other people's welfare. Her approach to fundraising was effective because potential donors trusted that their money would be used wisely and compassionately. Her relationship with David was strong because it was built on mutual respect and shared values rather than authority and compliance. Ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer announced, we're approaching the final items of the evening. But before we continue, our host Sarah Mitchell has asked for a few moments to share some important news about the Foundation's upcoming projects. Sarah returned to the podium, and Marcus noticed that the room's attention focused on her immediately. There was no need to call for quiet or wait for people to stop their conversations. She commanded natural respect that required no enforcement. I'm thrilled to announce that the Children's Future Foundation has been selected to receive a $5 million matching grant from the Morrison Foundation, Sarah said, and the applause was immediate and sustained. This incredible generosity will allow us to expand our scholarship program to 3 additional cities and establish a new mentorship network that will connect young people with opportunities they never thought possible. $5 million. Marcus felt the number resonate through his consciousness like a struck bell. The Morrison Foundation was one of the most prestigious charitable organizations in the country, known for supporting only the most effective and well-managed nonprofits. Being selected for such a substantial grant was recognition that Sarah's foundation was considered among the very best in its field. During their marriage, Marcus had often lectured Sarah about the importance of thinking big, of having ambitious goals, and pursuing them relentlessly. He had believed that she lacked the vision and drive necessary for significant accomplishments. Now she was operating on a scale that rivaled many for-profit businesses, and doing so with a level of effectiveness that had earned recognition from the country's most sophisticated philanthropists. This matching grant means that every dollar raised tonight will have twice the impact we originally anticipated, Sarah continued. Your generosity this evening will directly translate into educational opportunities for hundreds of additional children who might otherwise never have the chance to reach their full potential. As Sarah spoke, Marcus found himself remembering specific conversations from their marriage with uncomfortable clarity. There had been times when Sarah had suggested that they use their wealth to fund educational programs or support struggling families in their community. Marcus had always dismissed these ideas as naive and impractical, arguing that their primary responsibility was to their own family's security and future. But Sarah hadn't been naive. She had been visionary. She had seen possibilities that Marcus, for all his business acumen, had been too narrow-minded to recognize. While he had been focused on accumulating wealth for its own sake, she had been imagining ways to use resources for meaningful impact. The irony was painful and undeniable. Marcus had spent years believing that he was the ambitious one in their relationship, the one with big dreams and bold plans. Sarah had been the practical one, the one who kept their domestic life running smoothly while he pursued more important goals. But Sarah's dreams had actually been bigger than his. She had simply been dreaming about different things. Now, Sarah said with a smile, let's finish tonight's auction and see just how much good we can do together. The final items were expensive and exclusive: a private dinner with a celebrity chef, a week at a private resort in the Caribbean, a collection of rare wines. Marcus bid aggressively on several pieces, driven by a need to demonstrate his financial power in this room where his ex-wife had somehow become the center of attention. But even as he spent money with characteristic extravagance, the final auction item was sold, and the evening began to wind down. Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. Every instinct told him to leave immediately, to escape this gathering before he had to face any direct interaction with Sarah or David. But he was trapped by the very social conventions that had brought him here in the first place. Simply walking out would be noticed and would generate exactly the kind of gossip and speculation that could damage his reputation in these circles. Instead, he found himself following the crowd toward the reception area where coffee and dessert were being served. The post-auction socializing was often the most valuable part of these events, where real business relationships were formed and important connections were made. Under normal circumstances, Marcus would have been working the room, identifying potential partners and opportunities. Tonight, however, he felt paralyzed by the knowledge that Sarah and David were somewhere in the same space. He had no idea what he would say if they encountered each other, no script for how to behave in this unprecedented situation. During their divorce proceedings, their interactions had been mediated by lawyers and conducted in formal settings. He had never had to face his ex-wife as a social equal, much less as someone who had clearly surpassed him in terms of respect and accomplishment. Marcus Wellington, a voice said behind him. He turned to see James Morrison, Charles Morrison's younger brother, and a successful businessman in his own right. I thought that was you. How are you enjoying the evening? It's been quite impressive, Marcus replied, grateful for a normal social interaction. The organization and execution have been remarkable. Sarah Mitchell really is extraordinary, James said with obvious admiration. The work she's doing with the foundation is changing lives in measurable ways. And that son of hers is going to be something special. 15 years old and already thinking like a seasoned nonprofit executive. Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond without revealing his connection to the people being praised. They certainly seem to have built something significant. You know, there's an interesting story there, James continued, apparently settling in for a longer conversation. Sarah was married to Marcus Wellington for years. Maybe you know him? Real estate Ruckus was aware that his gestures felt hollow compared to the substantive accomplishments being celebrated around him. Purchasing luxury experiences was easy when you had substantial wealth. It required no particular skill or vision, just the willingness to write large checks. Building something like Sarah's foundation required qualities that Marcus was beginning to realize he had never fully developed. As the auction drew to a close, Marcus found himself facing an uncomfortable truth. He had spent years congratulating himself on his success, measuring his worth by his net worth, believing that his ability to accumulate wealth made him superior to people who prioritized other values. But tonight had forced him to confront the possibility that there might be forms of success that were more meaningful and more difficult to achieve than simply making money. Sarah had built something that would outlast her, that would continue making a positive difference long after she was gone. She had raised a son who was confident, principled, and committed to making the world better. She had earned genuine respect from people whose opinion mattered, not because of what she owned, but because of what she had accomplished. Marcus owned a great deal, but what had he actually accomplished? His business success had been built largely on taking advantage of other people's weaknesses and circumstances. His wealth was substantial, but would likely die with him, benefiting no one except perhaps David, who seemed to have little interest in inheriting his father's approach to life. The evening was drawing to a close, but Marcus knew that his real education was just beginning. Everything he thought he understood about success, about value, about what made a life worth living, had been called into question by witnessing what his ex-wife had achieved after leaving him behind. The most disturbing realization was that Sarah and David seemed happier and more fulfilled without him than they had ever been during their years as a family. Their lives had not been diminished by his absence. They had been liberated by it. Before we continue with tonight's auction, Sarah said, I want to introduce someone who has been instrumental in making this foundation's work possible. My son David has not only provided creative input on our programs, but has also demonstrated remarkable leadership in engaging his own generation with our mission. David stood and walked toward the podium with the same confident bearing Marcus had noticed earlier. Father and son made eye contact across the room for just a moment, and Marcus was struck by the lack of recognition or acknowledgement in his son's gaze. David looked at him as he might look at any stranger in the crowd, with polite indifference. When my mom first told me about her plans for the foundation, David said, his voice clear and mature beyond his 15 years, I thought it sounded like a nice idea. But as I've gotten more involved, I've realized that this isn't just charity work. This is about justice. It's about making sure that talent and hard work are rewarded regardless of economic circumstances. Marcus watched his son speak with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The young man at the podium bore little resemblance to the quiet, uncertain teenager he had tried unsuccessfully to connect with during their last visit. David spoke with conviction about social issues, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex problems, and clearly commanded respect from adults who were decades older and infinitely more experienced. Where had this confidence come from? During their marriage, Marcus had often worried that David was too soft, too introspective, too uninterested in the competitive aspects of life that Marcus considered essential for success. He had tried to toughen the boy up through various activities and experiences, But David had always seemed to resist his father's efforts to mold him into a more aggressive, ambitious person. Now Marcus could see that David hadn't lacked confidence or ambition. He had simply been interested in different things than his father valued. While Marcus had been focused on building wealth and climbing social ladders, David had been developing his own sense of purpose and direction. And clearly, Sarah had supported and nurtured these interests in ways that Marcus had never thought to try. The truth was that Marcus had built his fortune by being ruthless when necessary, and some of his business practices had left scars on people who moved in these same social circles. He'd foreclosed on properties, bought out competitors at unfavorable terms, and generally approached business with the philosophy that winning was the only thing that mattered. But that was business, he told himself. Personal relationships were different. Or at least, they should be. The problem was that Marcus had never quite learned where to draw that line. His marriage to Sarah had suffered because he'd treated their relationship like another deal to be managed rather than a partnership to be nurtured. His relationship with his son David had withered because he'd tried to teach the boy about success instead of simply spending time with him. Now David was 15, living primarily with his mother, and had little interest in the world that Marcus had built for him. The boy preferred books to business, art to acquisitions. He was everything that Marcus couldn't understand and, if he was honest with himself, everything that Marcus envied about his own lost youth. "The auction's about to begin," announced the same voice from earlier. "Please take your seats and prepare for an evening of generous giving." Marcus found himself assigned to table 12, surrounded by other individuals whose net worth placed them in the upper echelons of society. The conversation at his table was predictably focused on market trends, political developments, and the usual gossip that circulated among people who had both the time and money to pay attention to such things. As the auctioneer took the stage, Marcus settled back in his chair with the comfortable confidence of someone who knew he could outbid almost anyone in the room for anything that truly caught his interest. The evening was unfolding exactly as he had expected, a pleasant diversion that would cost him some money but would reinforce his position in the social hierarchy that mattered to him. He had no way of knowing that everything he thought he understood about his life was about to change. The evening ahead would challenge every assumption he'd made about power, success, and the people he'd left behind in his climb to the top. But, for now, Marcus Wellington sat comfortably in his assigned seat, completely unaware that he was not the most important person in the room, and that the person who actually held that distinction was someone he'd dismissed long ago as irrelevant to his carefully constructed world. The first item came up for bidding, and Marcus raised his paddle with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. Around him, the gentle murmur of wealthy people spending money on beautiful things created a soundtrack that he found deeply satisfying. This was his element, his natural habitat, and he moved through it with the ease of someone who had never questioned whether he truly belonged.